Okay, welcome back again. This is our last session of the last class of 415 Development and Growth 1. So last time I mentioned about a child penalty, right? In with respect to in the context of um, gender inequality, there is this recent study that uses the administrative data from Denmark, and that very in a very interesting way and very convincing way shows why child penalties are important. So let me first share and discuss it, and then I will have a closing discussion about randomized control trials and the fundamental problems of development economics. Okay, so the paper is here. Now, this paper is written by 3 authors. Let me go to the first page. So children and gender inequality evidence from Denmark. So this is the quick, of course, this is abstract. So let's all read the abstract. Let me read it out though. So using Danish administrative data, we study the impacts of children on gender inequality in the labor market. The arrival of children creates a long-run gender gap in earnings of around 20%, driven by hours worked, participation, and wage rates. We identify mechanisms driving these child penalties in terms of occupation, sector, and firm choices. We find that the fraction of gender inequality caused by child penalties has featured a dramatic increase over the last 3 to 4 decades. Finally, we show that child penalties are transmitted through generations from parents to daughters, suggesting an influence of childhood environment on gender identity. So I'm not going to cover all the paper, I mean the full extent of paper, but first I want to show you the info about the data. So there is this info here. Where's that? Here. So their analysis is based on first births within a marriage, all right? And the parents are observed every year between 5 years before having the child, okay, and 10 years after having the child. So, and that will be for the first child, okay. And they are focusing on the first childbirth between 1985 to 2003, and they have the entire data, okay, for Denmark. All right, so that's important. This is not a sample. So in a way, right? This is the universe of all first childbirth. So they have 15 years in total. They have 470,000 birds, and they have then 15 million individual year observations. Okay, because there are 2 parents, and for 15 years, this is their data. Okay. And this is the main figure I want to focus on. That's very, very interesting. When I first saw this on Twitter, I was just wow. Look at this. So what you see here is this. The red vertical line is the time of the first childbirth, okay? And these numbers are averages. All right? So these dots are averages. So in gray color, these are for fathers. Okay, in gray color, these are for fathers. Black is for black line, and black dots is for mothers. Okay, and all of these are averages of these, like, very, very large number of people. Okay, and of course the date of the birth differs, right? I mean, the year of the birth for all these 470,000 birds, the year is different, but now you can collect all of them because now you are normalizing in terms of the date of the childbirth. Okay, then you take these averages, for instance, this is for earnings, okay? And this number is now relative for T minus 1. T equals -1 here. So before the birth, all right? So what happens after the birth? These figures are measuring that. And you see what happens, right? So before the birth, earnings are pretty similar, right? Between males and females, between mothers and fathers. Of course, we do not now look at whether they are married or whether they were, engaged here, or whether they were just girlfriend or boyfriends. But we do see that before the first childbirth, earnings are pretty same. Okay, there's practically no difference here. But then after the birth, 1 year after the birth, earnings of the mothers decrease sharply. Okay, around, more than 20%. In the second year after the birth, the decrease is even larger, around 30%. Then there is a recovery, a partial recovery though, right? Look at here. For father, there's almost no change after 2 years. For mother, there is still a large decrease, and that decrease, eventually that difference after 10 years is around 20%. Okay, so father's earning also decrease a little bit after 10 years, but mother's persistently lower. So there is a permanent effect on mother's earnings. Now, of course, earnings are functions of three things, right? Hours worked, participation rates, and wage rates. So let's look at hours worked. Again, there is practically no difference before the birth. Okay, then we see the difference in the hours worked. Okay, in the first year, in the second year, so that is even larger. All right. Then there is the recovery, and then there is the permanent effect, the same. Now look at what happens to wage rates. Okay, now wage rate is basically what you contract for with your employer, right? So there's a decrease, and if you look at closely, actually there is a confidence band there. So let me show. Oops. Okay, let me show you that figure even closely. So as you see, there is a confidence band. So in the earlier figures, the confidence band, some of the estimations are unconditional, so there is no confidence band around them. For some estimates, so wage rate is basically estimated conditionally, so there's a confidence band, so it's basically a regression there. But confidence band is pretty tight. Why? Because they have this huge sample. Their sample size is very large. Now, we see the effect on the wage, we see the effect on participation rate as well. So some women do not participate in the labor market after the child. All right, so the average participation rate is lower for mothers, permanently lower. All right. So then in the rest of the paper, of course, they explain the reasons for this using other types of analysis. I read this paper some time ago, so I don't remember each and everything. But for instance, in terms of occupation, occupational rank is here, so they look at here only one type of occupation, I guess. So this is probability of being a manager. In the last session, I discussed managerial positions, women face discrimination, right? Negative discrimination. Now, what you see here is the manager dummy. When you count for that, the probability of being a manager is pretty similar before the birth, right? is pretty similar before the birth, but after the birth, the probability of being a manager for the mother decreases, and permanently again. Okay, in the long run, that probability is 26% lower, 26 percentage points lower. So this is female manager with children dummy. So probability of having a female manager with children, again, pretty similar, but then, of course, now the effect is reversed, right? Because we have the children dummy. And in the public sector, the situation, so here, the mother's manager is female, all right? So etc. So if you are interested in the paper, you can just find it and read it. Some parts are technical, of course. You can forget about that. One technical info for I mean, because it is important. So here, what you see here is called parallel trends. Okay, so this is a parallel trends assumption. And why is that important? Because we want to associate all the difference with what we see here to the childbirth, right? We want to isolate the effects of the childbirth. So for this to be true, then before the childbirth, we have to satisfy this parallel trends assumption. Okay, and in econometric applications, you can check for that. There are certain tests and certain corrections. Okay, so that was for the child penalty argument. Now, finally, I want to spend some time on the importance of randomized controlled trials. Now, in this lecture, you know, in this whole series, you got the idea that my approach or the overall approach of your textbook is kind of a macro approach. But as always, macroeconomics have microeconomic foundations. So if you look at, for instance, the O-ring model, right? In the O-ring model, we have firms, we have workers. So we still carry out our analysis at the micro level. So that's, of course, a methodological thing, right? A methodological issue that we can discuss for hours and days. But the thing is that even if we want to approach to these macro questions with micro models, we always had this focus on comparative economic development, right? Why some countries are poorer, why some countries cannot grow faster, why some countries realize their takeoff to the modern growth later than others, right? So those are the things that create historical differences. I mean, when we look at today, when we look at the present data, and when we compare countries with respect to their real income per capita levels, of course, we see the long-run effects of many different events in the past, right? About demographics, about human capital accumulation, about revolutions or civil wars and all this stuff. Now, in recent decades, experimental approaches in economics, of course, gained some popularity, and that's for obvious reasons, right? I mean, most of the time, economists are using these empiricist methodologies. They're because they have models, and models are for models are for explaining the real world. So then, although these models are not perfect, they are always assuming of a certain important aspects of reality. Sometimes they could be helpful. They could be explaining stuff. They could be telling us important lessons or messages about underlying mechanisms or causality. All right. Now, experimental methods are important. We know this from the long run history of physical sciences or natural sciences, in physics, in chemistry, in biology. So all these sciences, experiments are important because most of the time those scientists in physics, in chemistry, they can have controlled experiments. Okay, so they create conditions of their experiments. So they create under they create a setup in the laboratory, and they experiment with the component. I mean, what it's they basically test the theory, right? And then in the next run, they can have exactly the same setup. I mean, most of the time, in most problems, they can control. They can control for other factors perfectly. Now, in social sciences and in economics, we cannot do that, right? Because our science is about humans. Our science is about societies, is about politics, institutions, etc. So we cannot really create um, those controlled experiments, right? So most of the time we look at observational data, right? So I go to the website of World Bank and I download the data for certain variables and for certain countries and for certain time periods. Okay, so that's useful. I mean, that I'm not saying that it's not useful. That's usually actually very useful to see what happened in the past, what's happening in the present, and possibly what will happen in the future. So our macro models always benefit from such data. Then we could have micro data as well, micro level observational data. So there are surveys, right? I mean, there's household budget survey, household labor force survey, there is demographic and health survey. So those surveys are usually representative for the entire country, and in certain cases for certain regions in the country. So here I mean, even if we do not have controlled experiments and we do not have experimental data, we can still have micro data, and we can look at many different problems using a representative sample. I mean, representative in the sense of statistical representation, right? So Turkey has a population of 80 million people. Of course, you cannot survey all these people because a survey takes, let's say, 2 hours. It is very, very costly. So you can only survey a particular fraction of people, but you do so in a very careful way by thinking about statistical representation. And then you have the sample, then you can use this data to test your theories. You can look at the data to document some patterns, etc. Now, the experimental approach in development economics is doing something else. All right, so they want to achieve the ideal conditions for a controlled experiment. Okay, so how do you do that? So one typical example is this, right? So there is this country in Africa, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa, there is this poor country, largely agrarian, right? Let's say 80% of people living in agriculture, living in rural areas and doing some agricultural work. Okay, income levels are particularly low in many regions of the country, and especially in rural areas. As you know, rural areas are typically poorer. And there's gender inequality, against women, and there's almost no industry in the country. Trade routes are closed. I mean, imagine the most daunting conditions for a poorest country in the world. All right. Now, the typical scenario is like this. So we have money. All right. We have the funds. So we have a large amount of money to spend on this scientific project. And the project is something like this. So we want to choose a number of households from a number of villages. All right. So these will be different families, let's say, right? So typically large families in these rural areas, let's say 5 kids, 7 kids, grandparents living with them, or certain relatives living with them, etc. So in this context, we want to choose a number of villages, and from each village, we want to choose a number of households. Okay, and then we want to give them something, some treatment. All right. Suppose that treatment is the use of contraceptives. Okay, suppose that this is a high fertility economy, which is of course very typical for poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So we want to see if these households have access to contraceptive methods, modern contraceptive tools, such as a condom, right? Whether that would affect their fertility patterns. So that would be your research question, okay? Now, of course, the problem is this. You do not observe many other stuff about these families, right? You observe some stuff, even if you have the money and the resources and you spend a lot of time with them, you cannot still observe many other things. You cannot observe the family history. You cannot observe the values those parents received from their families when they're kids. You do not observe their tribal routines, their customs, etc. Okay? So the problem is that you want to, if you want to isolate the effect of the access to contraceptive methods, let's say access to condoms, you have a way, you must design a research methodology that really isolates the effect of the treatment. The treatment here is contraceptive method. Okay, the access to the contraceptive method. So what you do is basically this, right? Let's say you have 4,000 families, all right? 4,000 families in, let's say, 300 villages from a particular country in sub-Saharan Africa, all right? Now, for 4,000 families, you randomly choose among them, okay? Approximately 2,000 of them will receive the treatment, okay? And the remaining remaining families, again, that will be approximately 2,000 because you are randomly choosing them. You are randomly choosing half of them, basically, all right? And the remaining half will not receive the treatment, okay? So then you have two groups. You went there at 2019, you chose 4,000 households, then you randomly choose 2,000 of them and give condoms, free condoms, large amounts. Whenever they want to use another condom, they can use it, okay? And the remaining 2,000 families, they do not receive the condom, okay? They do not know about that, okay? Then you observe these people in the next, let's say, 5 years. The same 4,000 families you observe, all right? Then, of course, you collect other types of data as well in between, right? What are their income levels? What are their family sizes? What are their occupations? What are their education levels, etc., 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 right? But then at the end, you have a pretty similar population, 2,000 families from a particular country and 2,000 other families from a particular country, and they are mixed, right? In terms of many different determinants, very different indicators. This is a mixed population because you randomly chose them. You first randomly chose these 4,000 families, okay? But then you again randomly divide them into two groups and give the treatment to only one group, where the other group becomes your control group. Now that's the way to isolate the effect of the treatment, right? Because in other respects, those 2,000 families in the treatment group are very similar on average, of course, those other families that are in the control group, okay? Now, if you see after 1 year, after 2 years, after 3 years, after 5 years, after 10 years, if you see certain differences across these groups, that difference must be, of course, associated with your treatment, okay? And let's suppose what you observe is that total fertility, okay, the number of births decreases, okay, in the treatment group. After 5 years, you compare the 2,000 families on the control group with the 2,000 families on the treatment group, of course, by taking averages, etc., and running your, regressions and controlling for other factors as well. And you realize in the treatment group, fertility is significantly lower. All right, then you say, okay, so in this country, in this particular poor sub-Saharan country, in rural areas, one way to decrease fertility is to give these people a chance to access contraceptive methods. Okay, so if they had condoms, and if they have access to such modern contraceptive methods, then they could be lowering their fertility. Okay, so what happened here? Well, we learned something about development, right? Obviously, that's about economic development, because we know the demographic consequences of development, and we know something theoretically about the demographic causes, right? So that's important. But is that really very good? I mean, is that really very important? Okay, because now we understand that, okay, so if these people have condoms, they're gonna reproduce less. That's very nice, but that's not really helpful about understanding why in this particular country fertility was already low. I mean, yes, that of course is about contraceptive methods. I mean, they do not have access to it, but there could be other reasons, right, that keep this country poor. There could be other mechanisms. So it is not really about identifying the causes. So yes, in that particular case, they identify the causes of high fertility. Okay, high fertility in rural areas are caused by not having access to modern contraceptive methods. Okay, of course, this is a very particularly simple example, but that's how it works. Now, Angus Deaton is an important development economist, or macroeconomist in general, and he's kind of not very convinced about these randomized control trials. I mean, yes, okay, even though there are some econometric problems, yes, that's nice stuff, but that doesn't really tell me about institutions. That doesn't really tell me about geography. That doesn't really tell me anything about culture. So these are the fundamental problems, fundamental causes that delay transition to modern growth, that delay development in many countries. So randomized controlled trials show us what would work, okay, in certain contexts, but it doesn't give us the holy grail of the development problems, the definitive answers to more fundamental, deeper questions, such as why countries in sub-Saharan Africa are poor for many long decades, hundreds of years. Okay, they don't tell us anything about the role of colonial history. They do not tell us anything about the geography's important role in the design of institutions. They do not tell us why civil war or ethnic conflict creates certain economic problems. Okay, so, and of course, you may still want to try to design randomized control experiments that somehow could be answering such questions, such deeper questions as well, but that's even more difficult and possibly much more expensive. All right, so there is this. So I'm more, I understand the econometric ingenuity in such approaches, and that's important, and they already got the Nobel Prize for that, RCT guys. But there is also this this room for, being very careful and a little bit thoughtful about the real usefulness of randomized controlled trials. And then finally, there is also this ethical dimension. If you had money, why not just give, modern contraceptive methods to all 4,000 households, right? So that's also an interesting question. Now we have 5 minutes, but we can reconnect again. I have time. So the floor is yours, your questions, your comments, anything you want to add. Again, we have time. We can reconnect again. Now the floor is yours. Very good.
Hocam sizin ekleyeceğiniz bir şey yoksa bizim yok herhalde sorumuz.
Tamam. Her şey demek ki çok açıktı. Bütün dönem boyunca her şeyi çok iyi anlattım. Zaten muhteşem bir hocayım. O zaman bana her zaman sorularınızı vesaire gönderebilirsiniz. Bugün bahsettiğim paper'ları da post ederim. Okay, so I will post the papers that I mentioned and discussed today. And I will see you in the final exam week there. Have a nice week, my friends.
Teşekkür ederiz hocam.
Bye bye.
Hoşça kalın.
Hoşça kalın.